We are going to be chatting about Reconstruction, discussing really what led to Reconstruction, which would be obviously the Civil War, and also how Reconstruction ended and its effects on the United States, in particular the South and African Americans who live in the South. As we go through our presentation today, there are a few key things that I would like you to be able to do and to be able to understand. So I want us, by the end of this, to know why Reconstruction ended. And I'm using Reconstruction here with a capital R because we are talking about a specific time period. So Reconstruction goes from 1865, when the Civil War ends, up until 1877. It ends with something called the Compromise of 1877. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I would also like you to be able to evaluate the successes and failures of Reconstruction. So what parts of this Reconstruction time period worked? What didn't work? What's the fallout also from those successes and failures? I would like you to be able to describe the experience of African Americans in a South that is rapidly changing and assess how whites created a segregated society in the South and also how African Americans responded to that segregated society. Some terms that you need to make sure that you know. First off, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Then the Redeemers, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Compromise of 1877, Jim Crow laws, poll tax, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and those three really go together. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells. Make sure you know those terms, those concepts, and those people. And when you see them in the presentation, you're also going to see one of these little wiggly stars to remind you that this is a term or a person or an idea that you need to be familiar with. I also want you to keep in mind the effects of Reconstruction. The Union is restored when the Civil War ends. Those southern states are brought back into the Union. African Americans gain citizenship and voting rights. Those voting rights will be limited as time goes on during the Reconstruction period with things like the poll tax, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, but they do gain citizenship and voting rights. The South's economy and infrastructure are improved. Remember, they had been devastated during the Civil War. Southern states establish public school systems. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and other groups emerge in the South and begin a campaign of terror against African Americans and others to some degree. And also the sharecropping system takes hold in the South. So as long as we can answer the questions or the to-dos, so to speak, from this slide here, understand these terms as well as the effects of Reconstruction, then we should be in decent shape going forward. So, Reconstruction, of course, comes at the end of the Civil War. And this map right here just reminds us which states were Confederate states, those states in purple, which states were part of the Union, those states in blue. You can also see the different capitals, that little star in Washington and in Richmond for the respective Union and Confederate capitals. And you can also see the territories that are not states yet, there in yellow. So we have to think here that after the Civil War, there are some decisions that need to be made. So what important decisions have to be made concerning the fate of seceded states and the rights of those freed from slavery? It's still unknown when the Civil War ends. What are we going to do as a country with the leadership in the South who decided to secede from the Union? How should they be punished, if they should be punished at all? Should ordinary citizens, soldiers who fought for the South, be held accountable in any way? And what do we do with newly freed slaves, with African Americans in the South? Are they citizens automatically? Does there need to be a separate amendment how are we going to enforce that? And what does citizenship look like for African Americans in the South? So, as I just sort of overviewed, the Civil War is over, the South has been defeated. The Southern economy has been absolutely devastated by the war. Southern infrastructure has been devastated. Think back to your middle school Civil War lessons about the burning of Atlanta. That's happening to some degree in many parts of the South. The focus of Reconstruction is actually to reconstruct, right? What are we reconstructing? We are reconstructing the Southern economy, and we are reconstructing Southern infrastructure. And by the way, infrastructure is things like railroads, roads in general, the structure of cities, that type of thing. So how do we rebuild? What resources? Who's going to pay for this? Does the Union make the South pay for it? Or does the restored Union step in and provide financial aid to the South, right? Because now that we are one country again, if you have a section of your country that is struggling so much with the devastation of the aftermath of the Civil War, then you are really going to see a drag on the economy for the country as a whole. So the idea is to commit some financial resources to the South to help them rebuild. So again, Reconstruction is the process the United States uses to readmit the Confederate States to the Union, and this is a time period that is usually referred to between 1865 and 1877. So on the image on the left here, we have Abraham Lincoln. The image on the right is his Vice President, Andrew Johnson. As we know, Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated and Andrew Johnson will become president. And he's very interesting because he is a sort of compromise candidate, a Southerner who wanted to remain loyal to the Union. And so once he becomes president, you have a Southerner as president whose Reconstruction plan will be a bit more lenient to his Southern brethren, so to speak. So the idea here, towards the end of the Civil War, when it seems like the North needs to come up with a plan for what reunification will look like, in December of 1863, President Lincoln is going to offer general amnesty. Basically, everyone come on back in. If you rejoin the Union, nothing bad is going to happen to you. His second inaugural address includes this quote, "With malice toward none and charity for all." Southerners would have to take an oath of loyalty. They would have to agree to any new laws that the North passed in regard to slavery. And some officials and military officers would be excluded. So high-ranking leadership in the South would not be allowed to be readmitted with full citizenship, voting rights. So there are going to be a couple of competing plans here. On the right, down here in the bottom right corner, it says Lincoln and Johnson, they want quick pardons for most Confederate soldiers. They want early constitutional conventions for Southern states. So the Southern states need to rewrite their constitution to include laws regarding freed slaves. And they believed that ending slavery was more important than securing equal rights for African Americans. So as long as slavery was over, they were going to leave the equal rights bit for a later time or for Southern states to decide themselves. Radical Republicans, whose position is explained on the left, felt differently. They wanted to punish white Southerners. They wanted to secure rights for African Americans. So it's not enough that they have been freed from slavery. Equal rights need to be secured for African Americans. And they wanted to issue a very harsh loyalty test for Confederate soldiers. The details of that were very vague, but they believed that there needed to be more than just an oath of loyalty, that they needed to renounce their past actions and their past loyalty to the Confederacy. So, the problem here is obvious. Opposing views within the Republican Party, this emergence of a faction of Republicans who are radical Republicans, who felt leaders of the Confederacy could not be allowed to return to power, and that African Americans should be guaranteed more rights, including a federal right to vote. So don't leave it up to state constitutions to decide whether or not African Americans can vote. There needs to be a national law here, a federal amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee African Americans the right to vote. Andrew Johnson comes to power after Lincoln's assassination. Like I said, he is a compromise candidate. He's not a Republican. He's actually a Tennessee Democrat. And he's going to propose this Reconstruction Plan of 1865, which would include amnesty for all former citizens of the Confederacy. There are very limited exceptions that would expire over time. There is some very real tension between radical Republicans in Congress as well as Southern state legislatures. So people on the ground in the South who are trying to make these new constitutions, and people in Congress, in the federal government, who are demanding or believing very strongly that certain rights should be embedded into our federal laws. So look over here at the left on this image, President Andrew Johnson. He is the vice president, and his plan is that the Southerners have to declare loyalty to the Union, but that is pretty much it. Also notice that he also, in his plan, stated that each state must ratify means to approve, the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment bans slavery. So those two things are his plan. He's criticized because he is a Southerner. He is from Tennessee, right? And so people believe that he is not treating the South harshly enough and that he needs to be more demanding when it comes to how he is going to treat Southerners who are wanting to be admitted back into the Union. So it's going to set up a fight between a Democratic president with a pretty lenient plan for admitting states back into the Union and a radical Republican faction in Congress who is incredibly angry with Andrew Johnson. So here are the plans laid out for you in a little bit of a different way. Lincoln's plan would have required 10% of a state's voters to take a oath of loyalty to the Union, and then a constitutional convention could be called. States had to accept the emancipation of slaves, but then pardons would be offered to former Confederates. Johnson required former Confederates with property over $20,000 to get a pardon in order to vote, and then they also had to ratify the 13th Amendment. The radical Republican plan is different. 50% of a state's voters had to take a oath of loyalty. It divided the South into 5 military districts, and that is what we do see happening. So you see the federal government sending troops into the South after the war is over to make sure that Reconstruction orders, so to speak, are being followed. It required states to adopt constitutions that guaranteed African American suffrage, and suffrage means voting rights. And it requires states to ratify the 14th Amendment also in order to seat representatives in Congress. And we'll discuss that in just a moment. Here are their plans laid out in a little bit of a different way. Feel free to go back and look at this more closely as you take notes. The Reconstruction Act of March of 1867 is going to nullify or cancel out Johnson's more moderate plans. He vetoes it, but it passes over his veto. And you'll see the former Confederacy divided into 5 military districts. So this tension between the radical Republicans in Congress and a Democratic president begin to intensify. There is a very old, not existing anymore, and really kind of crazy law called the Tenure of Office Act. And it basically said that a president can't fire members of his own cabinet, that Congress had to remove them. But remember that Johnson comes to office after the assassination of Lincoln, and he comes into office with a cabinet that he did not appoint. Lincoln appoints this cabinet. So he fires one of them. He fires Edwin Stanton, who is his Secretary of War, who had ideas that were very different from his own. And because of that, Congress impeaches him. He's our first president to be impeached. As you know, there have been others, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump. He's impeached, but he is not removed from office. He's actually one vote short from removal. Here are the military districts, and you can see how everybody is divided up into these 5 districts. You can also see in the red, those are the date that the radical Reconstruction government is sort of ousted from that area, basically when the constitutions are approved. And you'll notice that the last ones are 1877, and that is when Reconstruction eventually officially ends because all military troops leave the South. So here are the amendments that we've been talking about that you need to know. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, slavery is banned in the whole United States. This is what Southern legislatures have to pass in order to be readmitted to the Union. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1866, all natural-born and naturalized citizens are citizens and subject to the same protections. This is often called the Equal Protection of the Laws Amendment. So basically, African Americans are now included in all of the laws of the country. So if you steal from them, it's a crime. If you kill them, it's a crime. They are afforded all of the same protections of the laws as every other citizen in the United States. Okay, then the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870, and it guarantees the right to vote, quote, cannot be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. It does not matter if you have ever been a slave. You can now vote. It does not say anything about your gender, though. Note that. We'll come back to that later on. There's a quick video I'm going to play here before we move forward.
In November and December 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, Southern states sought to control their large populations of newly freed black people. Laws were passed authorizing the arrest and jailing of blacks. These laws became known as black codes. They typically applied only to blacks and criminalized acts that were not offenses when committed by whites. On November 24th, 1865, Mississippi passed a black code declaring that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes found without proof of employment or found unlawfully assembling themselves would owe up to $50 in fines and serve up to 10 days in jail. As a result of black codes, the post-Civil War era brought American black citizens more contact with the criminal courts and prison systems than ever before. As the former Confederacy learned to use the criminal justice system as a tool of racial control, countless black men, women, and children were convicted and sentenced under unjust laws that criminalized them for existing as free black citizens.
Okay, so they're talking about black codes there, obviously. Although these amendments needed to be sort of ratified and passed, and the Southern states had to agree to this idea or this concept of freed slaves, the right to vote, equal protection under the law, they did not want freed slaves to become part of the fabric of Southern society. They wanted to keep them separate and other. And so what you see are Southern states adopting laws that are specifically targeted toward Black people. And as they're mentioning in the videos, they're small laws. If they're out after a certain time, they can go to jail. If they are if they're gathering in too large of a group, they can go to jail. If they are in a wrong neighborhood, they can go to jail. So you start to see laws passed in the South targeting African Americans in particular. And these are going to be called Black codes. And later on, we're going to talk about something called Jim Crow laws, which apply here as well. There's a political cartoon over here that you may see again. You have the KKK and also something called the White League uniting to essentially oppress African Americans. And the thing on that little shield banner there, it says worse than slavery, which I'm sure some may argue with. But the idea is that although they are freed, they are still very oppressed in the South. There are jobs that it is illegal for them to do. There are places that it is illegal for them to be. So yes, they are freed, but there are still so many oppressive restrictions. By the fall of 1870, all former Confederate states are now returned to the Union, and we see the formation of something called the Freedmen's Bureau. There's a flyer for it over here on the right. It helps formerly enslaved people and war refugees. We can help you find a job. We can help you find a home. We can help you understand how property rights work. Come to our meetings. We can help you make sure you're navigating the legal system appropriately. African Americans also, now that they are guaranteed the right to vote, they start to hold public office. This is very scary for a faction of white Southerners, a large faction of white Southerners that call themselves the Redeemers. Because as African Americans start to vote, not unsurprisingly, they start to vote African Americans into public office. The fear is, A, they don't want African Americans in public office, but B, they tend to be Republicans. And the worry is that the Democratic South is going to become a Republican stronghold. So you see a push by a group called the Redeemers to try to limit who can vote, right? Now, voting African Americans into office, it's not just African Americans voting for African Americans. It's also this new sort of Republican coalition. Southern-born white farmers who want more rights. They may have smaller farms, not plantation owners, right? African Americans, and also carpetbaggers from the North. Carpetbaggers are people who it's a derogatory term, first of all. It's not a nice thing to say. They come from the North to the South, and they are seeking economic opportunity. Southerners view this as very opportunistic, that they come in with their money and they're taking advantage of a South that's down on its luck, sort of trying to invest in it early when prices are low so that they're successful in the end. They're called carpetbaggers because of these like tapestry suitcases that used to be around, and so they would bring their suitcases down. They're not true Southerners, but they come in, they live here, and they vote, and they're voting primarily Republican. This political cartoon is really well known. You'll probably see this on an assessment at some point. It's actually a real person named Carl Schurz. He is a immigrant, and he is a well-known, successful, what they would call carpetbagger. And his most famous quote is actually really lovely. He says, "My country, right or wrong, if right to be kept right, and if wrong to be set right." Now you see here him depicted in an extremely derogatory way as a carpetbagger from a Southerner perspective. There's another term that starts to be floated around in the South called a scalawag. A scalawag is a term for a Southern Republican. So it's a derogatory term. If you live in the South and you're a Republican and you're a supporter of Reconstruction, then you're viewed as a traitor and you're called a scalawag. So carpetbaggers from the North moving to the South, scalawags in the South supporting Republicans, and white Southern Democrats don't like either of these groups, hence the derogatory names. Now, what is going to end Reconstruction? It's going to be something called the Compromise of 1877. That's going to sort of begin with the election of Ulysses S. Grant as president in 1869. He's a former general, but his administration is widely known as one of the most corrupt administrations in the history of the United States. It's not necessarily him that is corrupt, but his cabinet. He puts people around him who are very scandalous, so to speak, if we want to put it that way. And since he's a Republican, you start to see some Democrats regain power in the South throughout the 1870s. This is going to culminate in the presidential election of 1876. That's going to pit a Republican named Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden, a Democrat. Now, hopefully you've never heard of President Tilden, right? But maybe you have heard of President Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, because he will win ultimately. But the election is controversial. There are disputed electoral votes, and it's going to lead to something called the Compromise of 1877. In the end, federal troops will pull out of the South, and this is what is going to end Reconstruction. And in return for Southern troops leaving the South, Southerners in the Congress agreed to throw their vote in for Rutherford B. Hayes, and he ultimately wins. So not every vote is going to be decided by even the Electoral College. Sometimes there's such a tie that it has to go to Congress. So this is where the compromise is. The congressmen say, we will vote for Hayes if you agree to pull troops out of the South. So this is the end of Reconstruction, 1877. Think about this timeline here. I want you to come back to this on your own time. And as it says down there, analyze information based on this timeline. Which event marks the last major success in protecting civil rights during the Reconstruction era? Because after the Reconstruction era is over, or really I should say during the Reconstruction era, even though African Americans are free, you see a severe limitation of their rights. So the rise of segregation. You start to see states pass laws that enforce segregation. These are going to become known as Jim Crow laws. In 1883, the Supreme Court overturns the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that had guaranteed certain protections for African Americans. Plessy v. Ferguson also states in 1896 that separate but equal is allowed. This court case is very important and serves as the legal basis for segregation for 50 years. Here are some examples on the right of Jim Crow laws. The first one's from 1930. It shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers. From 1903, it shall be unlawful for any white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained to a Negro prisoner. That looks like 1926. No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. So the thing is that even though Reconstruction ends, segregation in the South does not. And that segregation is codified into law, collectively known as the Jim Crow laws. So during Reconstruction, the federal government had sought to secure equal rights for African Americans. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, however, African Americans and other minorities experienced a narrowing of those rights. During the Jim Crow era, though, I don't want you guys to think that African Americans were just like, oh no, we're so oppressed. They actually really band together here, and we start to see a lot of pushback against Jim Crow laws. The civil rights movement, oftentimes we think of as just Martin Luther King Jr., in the 60s and the Civil Rights Act of the 60s and things like that. But it actually is going to begin during Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Movement has its roots here. So what they start to do as an example of how to limit Republican victories in the South is diminish the voting rights of African Americans. So here, the 15th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But Southern states start to think Can I deny the right to vote based on other factors? So in 1890, states like Mississippi start to require citizens registering to vote to pay a poll tax. So I have to pay to vote. Now, if I am a newly freed slave, I have very little money, right? So maybe I can't afford the poll tax. This interestingly also affects poor whites who may not be able to pay the poll tax either. There's also going to be a literacy test. Can you read and understand the state constitution? I would argue that today a lot of US citizens could not read and understand any state constitution, right? These sorts of literacy tests and poll taxes are widely adopted. And keep in mind also with the literacy tests that it was illegal to educate African Americans for much of U.S. history up until and through Reconstruction. So many former slaves are illiterate, but also many poor whites are illiterate. Louisiana is going to be the first to introduce something called the grandfather clause. Anyone can vote if they had an ancestor who could vote before 1867. Well, that's going to eliminate all freed slaves, right? So they're basing it not on their condition of previous servitude, but on their grandfather's condition of previous servitude. And this is a little chart here that's going to help us understand how Southern states imposed restrictions on African American voting rights. They used violence, they used poll taxes, literacy tests, property tests, secret ballots, grandfather clauses, and all white primaries. So only whites could vote in the primaries, but everyone potentially who passed those other tests could vote in the general election. There are a couple of names, three names in particular that I want to throw out here that you guys should be familiar with. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are two of them. So they are going to be competing African American voices. Both of them are going to call for more rights for African Americans, but they're going to do it in different ways. And actually, these two men disagreed with each other a good bit. Booker T. Washington is going to propose that African Americans should focus on achieving economic success before achieving political success. He's famous for saying, cast down your bucket where you are. So you need to work within the existing system to build yourself up economically. And then once you are economically successful, then the country will respect African Americans enough to provide them with other political rights. He sort of adopted this idea or spread this idea through something called the Atlanta Compromise, which is a speech given in 1895, where he advocated taking a step back from the civil rights movement to focus on education in preparation for eventual equality. That's why you see a lot of schools named after Booker T. Washington. The W.E.B. Du Bois, who is pictured there in the bottom right, his famous quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." He rejected the Atlanta Compromise. He did not believe in waiting for civil rights. He, in 1903, published a really well-known book called The Souls of Black Folk, and he saw no advantage in delaying the fight for civil rights, and particularly he focused on voting rights for African Americans. Ida B. Wells is somebody else we should all know, and she's actually a Memphian. She's a journalist. Her famous quote here, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." She published a paper where she would reveal the victims of lynchings, and she published things about them, who they were. So it is a campaign against lynching. She launches her newspaper from Memphis, Tennessee. She is literally chased out of town by an angry mob. So she's forced to move to Chicago, where she continues her activism. Lynching is something that becomes incredibly widespread in the South. From 1890 to 1899, 154 are executed by hanging without trial, that should say, on average per year, not total, on average per year. And Ida B. Wells is committed to exposing that violence. And then there's also a woman, Mary Church Terrell. She is also an anti-lynching activist. She is fueled by the lynching of a close friend of hers. She helps to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. She also forms something called the Women Wage Earners Association. And she is involved in some early examples of civil disobedience, leading a boycott against a store in Washington, D.C. for refusing to serve African Americans. So, this ends our conversation about Reconstruction. Please be mindful of the slide that we started with in the beginning, where we went over the questions that we should be able to answer and the terms that we should know. Thank you.